Hello, and thank you for visiting Barbecue Stories channel. Be sure to subscribe. Leslie, my love, and my curse, why did I ever have to meet you? Because of you, I had to make the hardest decision of my life. It's devastating to discover your wife's infidelity, but it's even worse to realize that the child you raised during all those years isn't yours. That's exactly what happened to me. I'm Riley, a 35-year-old man from a small town in the Midwest. My childhood sweetheart and wife of 13 years is Leslie. We grew up next door to each other, so from childhood, we were inseparable, playing street games together right through our senior prom. I think I always had feelings for her, but I was too shy to act on them at first. I still vividly remember the moment when I finally mustered the courage to ask Leslie out in middle school. We eventually attended the same state college, me for business, her for economics. To save on expenses, we got an apartment close to campus. After we graduated, Leslie began working at a bank, though she had dreams of one day owning her own coffee shop. I launched an online home goods business that steadily grew. A few years into our marriage, when my business flourished, I was able to buy Leslie a space for her own cafe. It was an exciting time. That same year, our son Dylan was born, and life felt perfect. But over time, I accidentally uncovered a shocking truth about my wife. One day, I decided to go for a full medical checkup because I had been feeling unusually fatigued, constantly tired, and drained of energy. Even my sex drive had diminished, and at times I felt a sharp pain in my side, like my liver wasn't functioning properly. The results from the tests were staggering. I was diagnosed with hemochromatosis, a genetic disorder that causes infertility and can be passed down hereditarily. I was floored. How could this be? I had a son, Dylan. I couldn't believe it. I requested more tests, hoping the diagnosis would change, but it didn't. The revelation left me with countless unanswered questions. The idea that Dylan might not be my biological son struck me like a bolt of lightning. It felt unreal, like I was living someone else's nightmare. I had never, in my wildest dreams, suspected Leslie of infidelity. We had been together for so long, and our trust had never been questioned. But, despite my disbelief, I couldn't just dismiss the possibility. Perhaps it was a mistake or an anomaly. My doctor suggested a DNA test to confirm whether or not Dylan was my son, and though it was an excruciating process, I knew it was the logical step. For the next week, I walked around in a daze, struggling to accept the reality of what was happening. When the DNA results finally arrived, they confirmed my worst fear: Dylan wasn't my son. My world shattered. There was no doubt anymore. Leslie had cheated on me and kept the truth hidden while I unknowingly raised another man's child as my own. I felt torn between anger and sadness, mixed with the reality that Leslie may not have known the truth herself due to my recent diagnosis. The night I received the test results was one of the worst of my life. I returned home in a state of confusion, my mind racing and clouded with thoughts. I knew I needed to confront Leslie, but I had no idea how to approach the subject. Over dinner, I shared with her the news of my hemochromatosis diagnosis. She seemed genuinely concerned, asking questions about the treatment and whether the condition was dangerous. I replied mechanically, not fully present in the conversation. Then, gathering my courage, I looked her in the eye and asked her the question that had been haunting me. Leslie, is Dylan really my son? Please, I need you to be honest. The color drained from Leslie's face, and she fell silent, nervously tearing a napkin in her hands. That silence was all the confirmation I needed. After a few moments, she asked why I was suddenly doubting Dylan's paternity. In a quiet voice, I explained, because with my hemochromatosis diagnosis, it's impossible for me to father a child. Leslie stared at me, biting her lip before finally saying, "But we have Dylan. Maybe God worked a miracle, giving us this blessing." I couldn't help but laugh bitterly at the notion. That's why I got the DNA test, Leslie, before confronting you. Dylan isn't my son. The test confirmed it. My voice trembled. So stop lying to me. Just tell me the truth. Who did you cheat with? At that, Leslie broke down, covering her face and weeping uncontrollably. Between sobs, she confessed everything. A year after our wedding, she had met a businessman named Edward at her cafe. He was married and had 3 kids of his own, but they had a brief affair. Leslie claimed she ended the relationship as soon as she found out she was pregnant, assuming the baby was mine since we had been trying for a child. She swore she never considered lying about the paternity and begged for forgiveness, insisting she loved me and our family. As Leslie poured out her confession, I felt completely numb. Her words washed over me like meaningless noise, barely registering in my mind. It was as if some part of me had shut down to protect myself from the overwhelming pain. Silently, I stood from the table and went to the guest bedroom, closing the door behind me. That night was one of the longest and most agonizing nights of my life. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind spinning with questions and doubts. How could Leslie have deceived me all these years? What would become of our family? Could we somehow move past this betrayal, or was our marriage beyond repair? A part of me still loved Leslie, we had been together since childhood and shared so much. But by morning, I knew the truth. There was no way I could remain married to her. The betrayal was too deep, the trust too shattered. Divorce was inevitable, and for everyone's sake, even Dylan's, I had to move on. The following morning, I woke up before dawn, wanting to avoid facing Leslie later that day. During my lunch break, I drove downtown to meet with a divorce attorney. I shared all the details: Leslie's affair, the child, and the DNA test. He listened carefully without interrupting, and then confirmed that we had solid grounds for divorce. He promised to get the paperwork prepared. Of course, the hardest question in our separation was Dylan's fate. That sweet boy was innocent in all of this. While he wasn't my biological son, I had raised him as my own, and we had developed a deep bond. Still, the idea of financially supporting Leslie was unbearable to me. I couldn't bring myself to pay child support for someone else's child, though I was willing to give Dylan my time and have regular visits. However, my lawyer warned me that legally, I had no strong claim. In the eyes of the law, Dylan was still considered my son unless his paternity was disputed in court. As I left the lawyer's office, one thing was clear: there was no turning back. Leslie's lies had shattered our marriage beyond repair. Difficult days lay ahead, but this was the only path forward. The week following my talk with Leslie was strained and bleak. The warmth, comfort, and joy that we once had during dinner or while watching TV had vanished. Leslie moped around, downcast and quiet, while I barely spoke and avoided being home as much as I could. We had become strangers living under the same roof. Even the air felt thick with tension and lingering resentment. Poor Dylan clearly sensed something was terribly wrong. He kept approaching both of us, seeking affection or play, but we were each lost in our own grief. I tried my best to hide my inner turmoil for Dylan's sake, and played with him whenever possible, but the overall mood was oppressive and somber. It was something we all felt deeply. When my lawyer had the divorce papers ready, I picked them up after work. Entering the kitchen where Leslie was making dinner, I tossed the folder onto the table and said coldly, "Here are the divorce papers. Read them and sign. Legally, I'm the sole owner of this apartment, so I'm giving you a few days to pack and move out. I'll even cover temporary housing for you and Dylan, but I'm not paying child support." "What do you mean you refuse to pay?" Leslie asked angrily. "Legally, you're still Dylan's father until paternity is disputed in court. You're obligated to provide for us. That's the law." I gave her a bitter smile and stared directly into her eyes. "The law is covered in those papers, so don't worry. I've also included my affidavit disputing paternity and relinquishing all rights and responsibilities toward Dylan. Sign it, and I'll no longer be his legal father." Leslie gasped, covering her mouth in shock. "The court filings are already in process," I continued coldly. "The DNA test will back up my case. Legally, I'll no longer be Dylan's father, which means I'm freed from all fatherly duties. So, make your decision quickly and sign those documents. Time is running out." Leslie froze, helpless and deflated. She clearly hadn't expected me to take this approach. "Riley, please," Leslie pleaded through her tears. "I know I've done something terrible, and I'm not asking you to stay with me, but don't take Dylan's father away from him. He loves you. To him, you are his dad." I cut her off sharply. "Don't you dare try to tell me how to treat Dylan. This is all your fault. You cheated, You lied for years. I softened my tone slightly. I love the boy, and I'll support him, but I will never forgive you. Please, forgive me, Leslie wailed, tears streaming down her face. I was young and foolish, not thinking about the consequences. Please find it in your heart to forgive me, for the sake of our shared past, for Dylan's sake. But I stood there, stony-faced, gazing at her with a mix of sorrow and contempt. It was over between us, and no excuses could change that now. She had destroyed my trust and my life. I couldn't forgive her. Post-divorce. Leslie was eventually forced to sign the divorce papers, but she refused to terminate Dylan's paternity. My lawyer informed me that, in that case, I had grounds to sue her for paternity fraud to avoid child support post-divorce. This required her to reveal the biological father's identity under oath, transferring the responsibility for child support to him. Within a week, Leslie and Dylan moved out of my apartment and into a rental of their own. The bitter divorce proceedings dragged on for months. On the day of the hearing, I sat beside my lawyer, while Leslie sat with hers. She looked anxious, her eyes nervously darting toward the judge. The hearing began with my testimony about why I was suing Leslie. Her lawyer questioned both me and my attorney before turning the attention to Leslie. She resisted revealing the father's identity for as long as possible, but the stern judge reminded her that she was under oath and had to answer truthfully. It turned out that Dylan's biological father was a former business competitor of mine, a man whose partnership offer I had turned down years earlier because I didn't see potential in it. Now, the ugly truth had emerged, with devastating consequences. Because Leslie had deceived me about fathering her child, the judge imposed a hefty fine on her. She broke down weeping in the courtroom. I was officially absolved of any child support obligations after the divorce. A few days later, I learned that my old rival had been hit with a child support order for Dylan. His wife immediately filed for divorce, seeking custody of their children and a large share of their assets. Within a month, his business had crumbled, leaving him bankrupt and deeply in debt. 6 months later, he was jailed for failing to make child support payments. Naturally, he could no longer afford to support Dylan, so Leslie was left scraping by with odd jobs. I still saw Dylan on occasion, spending weekends together, riding amusement park rides, feeding pigeons, and talking about everything under the sun. It was during one of these outings that Dylan mentioned how tight money was for Leslie, as she struggled to stay afloat. Despite my affection for the boy, I felt no pity for my ex-wife. She had no one to blame for her miserable situation but herself. That's the story. Share your thoughts in the comments about this situation and the behavior of the spouses. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like this video, as it greatly helps to promote the channel. Take care, and have a wonderful day.